Listen to the 48 Hours podcast for shocking murder cases and compelling real-life dramas from one of television's most watched true crime shows. Go behind the scenes of each episode with award-winning CBS News correspondents and producers in Postmortem, a weekly deep dive. Listen to 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts.
Inspired by the life of the savvy and ambitious Colombian businesswoman Griselda Blanco comes a new Netflix original limited series. Griselda tells the story of a devoted mother who, with her lethal blend of charm and relentless savagery, creates one of the most powerful cartels in history. Witness Sofia Vergara's captivating transformation into the godmother of the underworld. Griselda, streaming January 25th, only on Netflix.
A note to listeners. The following podcast contains content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Discretion is advised.
It's a very alienating and chaotic time in New York City, fraught with crime, as I said. And then out of the mist and out of the darkness comes this specter of Son of Sam, who just loomed as a demon in New York City at that time. It grew and it became a complete obsession with him. I would say it totally took over his life, this notion that he could somehow serve Satan and find the meaning that he was looking for.
You are listening to Partners in True Crime. We are your hosts, Rob and Cindy Dorfman.
Welcome back to The Killing Hour with Doc Bonn. Today we will be starting off our series of interviews relating to infamous serial killer Son of Sam.
Doc Bonn spent time writing to and meeting with David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam killer, who terrorized New York City in the 70s.
Today Doc Bonn will share his unique experience and relationship with Berkowitz, and you'll be surprised to hear his analysis on whether or not the Son of Sam killer is insane or not. It's time to start The Killing Hour with Doc Bonn.
All right, so we're back on with Doc Bonn and our journey to understand serial killers, and we've been spending a lot of time talking about BTK and having a lot of guests who could explore that mind, which is pretty vast and twisted, and I think we've gotten a good handle on that, and even an amazing story from his daughter, Carrie Rawson, who was those two-part interview was just amazing, and I'm hoping that our listeners like that as well. But I think let's start shifting our focus to your other expertise on Son of Sam and how your perspective and what you think about him. And let's just start off with your overall viewpoint of Son of Sam, and then we'll get into more specifics. So tell us, what's your overall perspective of David Berkowitz?
Well, great question, and I appreciate that segue. As you know, I extensively corresponded with David Berkowitz, which culminated in an incredible afternoon session in prison with him that included lunch. But in order to really understand David Berkowitz and the phenomenon of the Son of Sam, you have to really look at the backdrop of New York City in the 1970s. And I moved to New York City from the Midwest in the late 70s, and I can tell you it was a very frightening place. New York City at that time the crime rate was tremendously high. The city itself was in a state of urban blight and decay and garbage on the streets. And there were literally neighborhoods that today we take for granted and are actually meccas of tourism, that you took your life in your hands just to go there. For example, Times Square. Today, Times Square is family entertainment and Disney shows. Back then, it was pornography, debauchery, organized crime, and murder. You literally took your life in your hands, walking through Times Square at that time. And you also, the 70s were such an unusual time sociologically, because you were coming out of the 1960s and the loss of innocence, and you had people that were striking out and looking to make a name for themselves. You guys probably are aware they called the 1970s the Me Decade, and the reason that they called it the Me Decade was exactly that. People were disenfranchised, alienated, coming out of the 60s, and they were saying, now it's my time. Now it's the lion's going to roar here. And you had such unusual and conflicting cultural phenomena happening. On the one hand, you had punk rock. You had clubs like CBGB downtown that had this very nihilistic, alienated music. And then you also had, at the very same time, the debauchery, decadence, drugs, and sex-fueled disco fever and disco mania at Studio 54. So you had these very conflicting lifestyles happening. And I would just say it was a very alienating and chaotic time in New York City, fraught with crime, as I said. And then out of the mist and out of the darkness comes this specter of Son of Sam, who just loomed as a demon in New York City at that time. And he literally held New York City, the greatest city in the world, 8 million people, in a death grip for an entire year, from the middle of 1976 until the middle of 1977. And many of our listeners probably know 77 became the Summer of Sam that lives completely in infamy. So in order to really tell the story and understand David Berkowitz, you have to understand this chaotic and really frightening environment that he was spawned from.
Moving forward with that, can you tell us a bit about David Berkowitz and his childhood? Do you think he was troubled as a youth, and that's what led to him becoming the Son of Sam?
Great question, Cindy. And yes, I would say the short answer is yes. He had a very troubled youth, not in the sense that he was abused or neglected in any way, but he was first and foremost born out of wedlock, and he was given up for adoption immediately after he was born. And he was adopted by a very loving Jewish couple in the Bronx, and their names were Pearl and Nathan Berkowitz, hence his last name. David was very much loved by this couple. They were a little bit older, and they were childless, and they really wanted to have a son. But he found out early on, when he was pre-adolescent, that he was adopted, but unfortunately they lied to him. They told him that his mother died in childbirth, and that was simply not true. As I said, he was given up. And what this led to in David was a sense of insecurity and inner turmoil, because he felt guilty. He felt guilty that he had been responsible for his mother's death, and he was also frightened. He felt that perhaps his father hated him, and that's why he gave him up, his biological father, and he actually feared that his father might come and look for him and try to kill him. So you can see how this would instill, very troubling emotions at an early age. And David became very surly. He became isolated. He hated school. He had very few friends. He got into fights. So yes, he had a very troubled youth, and so much so that Pearl and Nathan actually got him some psychological help. Took him to a therapist, but obviously it didn't stick, because we know what happened. And
do you know what age, real quick? Do you know what age they took him at the therapist?
Yeah, teens, early teens.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was he already setting fires at that point, or was that earlier?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, and thank you for that. For that segue as well, because I was about to say he gained this interest in pyromania. Pyromania is it's not necessarily a precursor to all serial killers, but you can certainly see how it's linked, because it was a sense of euphoria for him. He would set these fires, and he would sit back, and he would feel powerful. He would feel, look what I did. I'm responsible for this. And there's usually also some sexual tension there, some sexual component of it, that he probably actually got a sexual release from that, and maybe combined it with masturbation. So it was part of what ultimately became a fantasy need for him. And he admits to having started more than 1,000 fires, although he was never arrested. He never was arrested for those crimes, but it was something that definitely gave him a sense of purpose and strength and power, and probably sexual satisfaction as well.
How old was he when he started
in his early teens, adolescence, let's say adolescence, and he did it up throughout his teen years.
So it seems like when he started becoming a teenager, that's when things started to shift.
Yeah, I would say right around adolescence, which, by the way, is very common, as you guys know. That's adolescence, and immediate pre-adolescence is often a time where these disturbing pathological needs and phobias and needs for domination and so forth start to occur. So it's consistent. It's consistent with the evolution of other serial killers.
Independent of his finding out about his childhood past and the news that was given to him that frightened him, were there any other kind of childhood trauma things that happened to him?
No, not. His childhood was pretty vanilla, very much like Dennis Rader, by the way. So there was no incest, there was no neglect, there was no torture or torment or anything like that. So he really seemed to evolve independently, and was always feeling different and alone and unfulfilled and just like he didn't fit in. Well, in fact, he told me very much when we got together, when I interviewed him in person, that he always felt different. He always felt separate, and he was always looking to become part of something.
Isn't that common, though, for most people going through adolescence? There is that awkward period in all our lives where we really don't feel like we belong, even when we do belong in some social circles and we have friends. I mean, I know just for me, I always felt weird and always felt like I was on the outside, even though I was a participant. There's always that awkward feeling. And then just as a parent and raising my kids, they both had that same feeling as well. So would you say that's pretty normal?
Yeah, but what was not normal was his reaction to it. I agree. I mean, I felt very awkward. I remember that like the ages of 13 and 14 and even 15 were very, very, very troubling. You don't have a sense of who you are. You're not a child anymore, and yet you're not an adult. It is very awkward. But not everyone starts fires. Not everyone gets into fights. Not everyone eventually evolves into a serial killer. So I would say what he was feeling was normal, but his reactions to it were not normal.
So why do you believe that he ended up becoming a serial killer?
The $1 million question, right? What was his evolution and what led him down this path? And I will say, first and foremost, and this is my take on it. Okay, there are other people who are gonna give you different timelines, different theories, because Son of Sam, as we know, is the thing of legend, and there are many legends associated with his evolution. But I'm going to tell you that after spending time with him and corresponding with him for a number of years, that I believe the primary thing that was going on with him is a complete lack of meaning, purpose, and self-esteem in his life. It's like he had this giant hole inside of him that he was trying to fill up. And I think that's initially why what led him to starting fires. He got a sense of euphoria and, like I said, power and control out of that. And so what he was really looking for throughout his adolescence, through his later teen years, was some kind of something to hold on to, something to give him foundation and purpose in life. And what happened was, right out of high school, at the age of 18, he entered the Army. And he told me, once again, in no uncertain terms, he thought the Army would give him some kind of purpose. He'd become a soldier and it would give him meaning. And he was hoping, this was during the Vietnam War years, he was hoping that he would go to Vietnam and become a soldier for the United States, and that would give him purpose. Well, he was very discouraged when he was sent to South Korea. And he didn't get to fight in Vietnam. And he said it was extremely boring. He hated it. And there, another thing happened that is very fundamental to his evolution. And that is, he had his actual first sexual experience. And it was with a prostitute. And he got VD. And as a result, he became very angry and ashamed. And it led toward an anger toward women. So what was already there, this sense of meaninglessness and self-hatred, now even has more purpose. And he told me that when he left the Army, he was more angry and felt more isolated than alone than even when he went in. So it did not give him what he was looking for. And when he came home, he again was looking for some kind of purpose. What am I going to do? This is where he discovered and began to dabble in Satanism. And he enjoyed it. it was thrilling to him. And somehow, in his delusions, in his need for something to hold on to, he began to believe that Satan was calling to him, that he could find purpose in his life by somehow serving Satan. And he fantasized about it. He fantasized that Satan would somehow come to him and almost bless him in a way, in a strange way, and give him this purpose that he was looking for. And he began to believe that if he killed for Satan, if he would actually let blood, as he said it, and serve Satan's needs, that he would find this sense of satisfaction and purpose in life that he was hoping for. And this evolved. This evolved over a while. He got deeper and deeper into it, and he became obsessed. He became completely obsessed with Satan. And late in 1975, the end of 1975, he struck out violently toward another human being for the first time, and he attacked two teenage girls, but with a knife, and he stabbed them. And he actually hurt himself along the way. Neither of them died. They were injured, but did not die. And he, as I said, cut himself. And he realized at that point that he would never use a knife again. It was he found it too uncontrollable. He wanted to be able to control the situation, which is what ultimately led him to using a revolver. And so this was late 75, and it was then the very next year that he actually shot and killed his first victims in the summer of 1976. So what happened, and this is again very consistent with serial killers, is that this fantasy grew, this hunger inside of him, and this need to fill up this hole inside of him grew until a point that he could no longer take it, and he had to act out. So I think that it would describe this evolution. And it was years, this was years in the making. No one wakes up, no serial killer wakes up in the morning, one day and says, gee, today is a great day to become a serial killer. It just doesn't work that way. Almost all of them that we can discuss and that we know well, you could trace an evolution and a progression over a number of years that led to what I like to call a tipping point, where they simply can't control that fantasy urge anymore, and they need to kill.
Did he say when he was exploring his Satanism and he was getting involved in that, did he tell you or anybody that was filling that hole that he had inside of him?
He never expressed it that way, or that I've ever heard, or he never expressed it to me that way. He simply said it became an obsession. So I guess you could interpret that as saying that it was giving him something that he needed, but he didn't express it that way. And by the way, when I talk about filling up a hole inside of him, those are my words. That's my interpretation of what he has said. That's my conclusion. He has never come out and said, I had a hole inside of me. Based on everything that I know and the time that I spent with him, this is my diagnosis. This is my conclusion.
Sure. Did he also, the other thing I was curious about, did he describe how he worshipped Satan? Did he do rituals? What books was he reading? Was he getting together with other people who were Satan worshipers? Or is this something that he was just doing solely by himself, that he was reaching out? Because obviously we didn't have the internet back then.
No, but we did have a lot of demon Satanistic movies at the time. It was like,
the 70s.
The 70s, like Rosemary's Baby,
Exorcist.
The Exorcist. I mean, a lot of really heavy Satanistic films that came out during that time period. And he loved
those movies. He very much loved those movies. He would watch them over and over again. In fact, he mentioned that. But as far as the specifics of his rituals, he did mention that he was involved in rituals, and he did mention that he associated with other like-minded people, but he didn't go into specific detail about it. But yes, he was not completely isolated and alone. He was not just sitting, with some kind of Satan platform in his house and and praying to it or something like that. He did associate with some other people in this regard.
Yeah, because I would imagine he would need some sort of reinforcement for that belief. And I think that's the only really way you get that back then is by mingling with other people who have that same belief and kind of feeding off their energy as well.
Exactly. There was no social media, as you said. There was no way to have community on the internet or any other way. So yes, some personal interaction was definitely involved, and it grew and it became a complete obsession with him. I would say just it totally took over his life, this notion that he could somehow serve Satan and find the meaning that he was looking for.
The stabbing that he did of these two women, was that something that happened, he just saw and he reacted to it and made him mad and he did it? Or was it something that was planned or calculated?
No, he went out on a hunt and found these young girls. By the way, only one of them has ever been confirmed. He says that he stabbed two teenage girls. The second one was never identified or found. The other one, Michelle Foreman, actually she did report it to the police and said that a man stabbed her. But it was, he saw someone that fit his fancy, someone that suited him, and he stabbed them. But it didn't go well at all. As I said, they were not life-threatening injuries that he inflicted. This was during the winter and they had heavy coats on, and it just didn't work out well, and he ended up cutting himself pretty badly in the process. So it didn't go as he had hoped.
Did it fit that profile of what he later was targeting when he was shooting people?
Well, young women. Yeah, young women. I'm not sure if Michelle Furman had long dark hair or not. I'm not sure. But they were definitely young women, and that's what he targeted.
Interesting.
Maybe because of his mother and the situation from when he was a child.
There was definitely an aspect of that. Definitely the way he... And what happened, actually, I'm glad you mentioned the mother, is he ultimately tracked her down. He found his mother, his birth mother, and for a very short time, they reconnected, he and also his sister, but it didn't go well. He didn't like the interaction with his mother. He said it was not satisfying. It didn't go the way he went, and so it actually led to further anger and alienation, and you might say, a hatred of women. So it was in the mix somehow. Definitely his relationship with his birth mother when he found out that he had been lied to and reconnected with her.
Is that a commonality with serial killers? I think we've talked about that before, because we know on some of them that we've spoken about and we've met, there was definitely mommy issues with these people.
Yeah. Well, Bundy. I mean, certainly Bundy. I mean, he's a quintessential example of that. So is there a correlation there? Can you cite examples of it? Absolutely. Can you say that there's any causality involved, that it's because of that they became serial killers? No, but there is a relationship there. I mean, you can identify, and so it's certainly Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer whose mother absolutely tortured him, locked him in the basement and burned him with cigarettes and tortured him. So he clearly had mommy issues.
Yeah, Gary Ridgway did too, and it was pretty disgusting.
Yeah.
But
so there is a core. I just want to say, it's so many times when you talk about serial killers, things come up like, well, head trauma and neglect and so forth. Statistically, and again, I'm a researcher, and I look at the actual data and compare across serial killers. There's no strong causality here, but there are some correlations where you can say, yes, these anecdotally, we can see this phenomenon among several of them, but that doesn't mean you can say that it's a necessary component to becoming a serial killer.
So how would you characterize him? Do you think he's a psychopath, or is he mentally ill, or is he a product of a circumstance?
Great question. He is what is known in serial killer profiling terms as a visionary serial killer. And a visionary serial killer is someone who is killing because a higher power of some sort is telling them to kill. And in his case, it's Satan. He believed that Satan was giving him this direction to go out and kill young women. Now, there have been serial killers who believe that God told them to kill. There are serial killers who might think that Martians told them to kill. And not surprisingly, it's this category of serial killers, visionary serial killers, who are the most likely to be mentally ill. Not necessarily that they are, but they're the ones that are probably most likely to be mentally ill. And the important thing to understand about David Berkowitz is that he was focused on the act of killing, not the process of killing. And that's an important distinction, because if you understand whether a serial killer is focused on the act or the process, you have great insights into their pathology and their motivations. So with David Berkowitz, what he needed to do was pull that trigger and kill someone for Satan. And therefore, he has accomplished what he needed to do. So therefore, he's focused on the act. He didn't care about the process leading up to it. He didn't know these people. He didn't track his victims. He didn't stalk them. He simply seemingly picked them at random because they fit this profile that he liked, young women with long dark hair. Also, the moment that he pulled the trigger and they were dead, he was finished with them. He had no more interest in these individuals. That's very different than a Gary Ridgway or a Ted Bundy or a Dennis Rader, BTK. These individuals are all about the process of killing. They frequently will stalk their victims. BTK would take copious notes. He would find someone who interested him. He would watch them. He would stalk them and take index cards full of notes on a prospective victim. And he would find out their routines. This was all part of a process of titillation and fantasy that led up to the killing. And in the case of Dennis Rader, as we know, part of what gave him his thrill was abducting and then spending time with them and torturing them and tormenting them and then ultimately killing them. And process-oriented serial killers like Ted Bundy and Ridgway are not necessarily finished with the body once they're done. Some of them do very terrible things, necrophilia, and even return to the bodies weeks later, and again have necrophilia with the decomposing bodies. So the serial killer who's focused on the process is very different than a Berkowitz. And it's also, if you think about it, it was a very impersonal way of killing. He used a gun. He shot them with this incredibly powerful revolver, 44 caliber revolver, and then he moved on. There was no need for flesh-to-flesh contact. He didn't need to spend time with them. It was kill and move on. So he is a classic act-focused visionary serial killer.
Now, I know when you went to visit him and also when you were writing to him, I don't know how much he kind of elaborated on his prior thoughts to killing, and from the moment he first killed someone after he tried stabbing those two women. Did he talk a little bit about, or anything about, what his mindset was and before he pulled out that first time, that 44 caliber, and shot someone? Did he tell him what led up to that? Anything like that?
Yes. At a very fundamental level, he said he felt like a soldier on a mission. And that's a direct quote. That's a direct quote from him that he said to me as I was sitting across from him. Remember, we talked before about him looking for a purpose. Well, it's almost in his delusional mind like Satan was his officer, a general, giving him his orders to kill. So he felt that he was given his marching orders and he was sent out to do this. It was an absolute must order that he could not deny. And that's part of the fantasy. Again, every serial killer has a fantasy that's being served by the killing. And his was that he was being driven by Satan. Satan had given him this order to kill. And by doing it, he might somehow be rewarded by Satan. And in his case, what he was looking for was ultimately some sense of peace and in a very strange way, serenity, because he was tormented and tortured. He couldn't sleep. He felt tormented at all times, and he was waiting for Satan to reward him. And Cindy asked me earlier, I didn't really fully answer the question. She asked me, is he mentally ill? Is he a psychopath? And I'm going to say no to both. Psychopath, definitely not, because he truly loved, and I believe he truly loved his adoptive parents. In fact, when Berkowitz and I sat and had lunch and talked together, his face became completely red, and the tears just came streaming down his cheeks. I mean, weeping openly in front of me as he talked about his adoptive father, Nathan. Nathan lived to be 101 years old. In fact, he died just a few years ago. And David felt that Nathan was the one person who stayed by him, come thick and thin, who never gave up on him, who never abandoned him. And he loved Nathan completely. And in fact, he said the one of the greatest regrets of his life was what he put his father through, because he truly loved his father. So that's not a psychopath. And
well, he had empathy. It sounds like he had empathy.
He did. Well, he did. That's why I'm saying he's not a psychopath. And I do not think, and he hasn't been treated for any sort of clinical mental illness. In other words, schizophrenia, psychosis. He doesn't take meds. He hasn't taken meds for those sorts of things. What I really think he is, or I should say was just an extremely emotionally disturbed, troubled individual, and profoundly so, to the point that he became delusional. But I don't think that he was mentally ill in either a clinical sense or certainly a legal sense, because he knew right from wrong. I would just say he was a very, very deeply troubled individual.
When he started talking about this dog, Harvey, who is the one that legend says told him to kill, where does that come from then, if he's not mentally ill or psychotic?
Yeah.
I mean, was he on drugs? Was he taking any? I mean, the 70s was just, a drug fest for everybody. Was he dabbling in any kind of psychotropics or any kind of hallucinogenic drugs at that time, or?
The short answer to that, Cindy, is no. In fact, he told me emphatically he was not into alcohol or drugs at all. And who knows, if he had the occasional drink or smoked the occasional joint, maybe he would have been able to relieve his anxiety, and maybe he wouldn't have been as wound up and needing, to act out the way he did. But no, he did not. And so you mentioned, Harvey, the dog. So let's talk a little bit about that. There's so many legends. I mean, that's the thing that makes the Son of Sam so fascinating. There's so many different storylines. There's so many different legends and myths that go along with this, and some of them are conflicting. And Berkowitz went out of his way to perpetuate some and then to negate others. So it's a bit confusing. But regarding the dog, here's the tale. Here's how it goes. So Berkowitz was living in Yonkers, and his neighbor was Sam Carr. And Sam Carr had a dog named Harvey, a black Labrador retriever, that barked like crazy at night. And Berkowitz already had trouble sleeping. So now you've got this dog barking all night, and it drove him crazy. He actually eventually shot the dog. He actually shot Sam Carr's dog. But the legend is, and Berkowitz did perpetuate this himself in letters and correspondence that we'll talk about, but the legend is that Sam Carr somehow personified Satan, and that Harvey the dog was a demon who was barking out his instructions to kill at night. And so this nocturnal barking that drove him crazy allegedly were the orders to go out and kill. Now, Berkowitz did allude to this in letters that he sent to Jimmy Breslin and that he sent to law enforcement. My belief is this is just mythology. This is a storyline that he created to scare the hell out of people, because he was looking for notoriety. He wouldn't have written to the police. He wouldn't have written to Jimmy Breslin, one of the greatest journalists of the 20th century, most well known, if he didn't want notoriety. And he, in fact, told me once again when we got together that he was looking to terrorize New York City in that time frame, and he damn well did it. So this was an extension of what he already believed, which is that Satan was somehow his benefactor and driving him to kill. But the business about the dog and Sam Carr being Satan and all of that, I think, was fiction. And he did it, I think, for two reasons: to scare the hell out of people, and also because if he realized if he was caught, that could allow him possibly to use the insanity defense, that he could portray himself as insane. So
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, it feels very manipulative.
And he told me, by the way, in no uncertain terms, I asked him when we were together at lunch, I said, tell me about the dog, tell me about Sam Carr. He laughed. He laughed. He said, I made it up. He said, I made it up. It was strictly to just, he said, it sounded scary. It sounded scary. And so he knew what he was doing. He was in control. He was not in a state where he didn't know what he was doing.
I know we asked you this question in regards to BTK and whether or not BTK was aware of Son of Sam and how he was controlling New York City. Was Son of Sam, did he ever mention, and David Berkowitz, did he ever mention that he was aware of BTK and any of that?
No, he did not. I do not believe that Berkowitz was, as Rader called himself, a student of the game. They have a different mindset. BTK, or Dennis Rader, is a complete narcissist and psychopath, and he's aware of others. Everyone is a competitor, and he wants to be a bigger name than everyone else. That's not what drove Berkowitz. Berkowitz was much more of a troubled soul, if you will. He did want notoriety, but he was not on a playing field where he was trying to compete with other serial killers. So no, he never even mentioned another serial killer to me.
During his killings, in between the killings, what was his life like? What did he do? What was he doing in his daily daily routine? What was it?
Really good question. He was a postal worker, a sorter, a letter sorter in New York, and which is a good job. It paid him pretty well. He was able to pay his bills, and he had no trouble at work that I've ever heard about. He showed up. He was a worker bee in that regard, and invisible. David Berkowitz is not very large in stature. He's not very. He doesn't stick out in any real meaningful way. He was just one of any number of millions of worker bees in New York City, but to answer your question about his cooling off period, he had absolutely that. He had a true cooling off period between his killings, and what I mean is, think of his need to kill, and the need to kill for almost any serial killer as almost like a heroin addict needing a fix. And you get that itch, and it just gets stronger and stronger. And it was the same thing with Berkowitz. He would feel that need that I must kill for Satan. And if I do it, then finally, I'm going to get that peace and that satisfaction that I'm looking for. Well, unfortunately for him, the fantasy need and the desire was always greater than the actualization of it. So he would kill, and he would say there would be some, momentary sense of euphoria or fulfillment, but very quickly it would drop back down to a low again. He'd go back down in the valley, in the pits, which is very similar, once again, to a drug addict, narcotics addict, where you get that momentary high, but then before you know it, you're back down, sometimes even lower than before, and the itch starts again, and you've got to do it again. So he was able to function, he was able to go to work and do his job, but very little else. Otherwise, he was constantly dealing with this craving, this internal need to kill. And as I said, he didn't sleep well. He was restless. He would literally pace in his apartment at night. He would go out sometimes, stalking the streets, looking for a victim, but not find one, and then go home and try to sleep again. So there were many nights where he went out on his hunt, on his mission to kill, if you will, but didn't fulfill it. So he definitely had those cooling off periods, but they were not contented for the cooling off periods. They were very troubling and unsettling to him.
He was called originally the 44 caliber killer, which is, I would imagine, because he was killing people with a 44 caliber gun. But moving on from that, how did he become known as the Son of Sam?
Months went by in New York where they didn't even know there was a serial killer, and because he was killing in different areas. He initially killed in the Bronx, and then he went to the Queens. So his second killings were actually in Queens, and it took them a while to link the crime scenes. And as you know, that's how serial killers are identified and eventually profiled, is by linking the crime scenes together. And so once they realized that there was an individual who was killing in different boroughs using this unusual and unique gun, this 44 caliber revolver, which is a very big, powerful revolver, they realized that they had a serial killer, and the news media jumped on that. Initially there was no other information other than the ballistics match of the gun, so that's how he became the 44 caliber killer. And I would go on to say people would ask me, well, why did he pick such an unusual gun? And I think that his need, once again, for recognition, his need for to make a statement, to be powerful, to be considered a person of substance, led him to use this incredibly powerful revolver. In a way, there's a phallic aspect of it. This large, masculine, if you will, weapon. I think it reinforced his need for identity and to fill up his lacking self-esteem. Now, as far as why he ultimately became the son of Sam, well, the short answer is he named himself. But I'll explain the process. He, once again, as I've said, had a craving and a need for recognition. He left a letter with one of his victims in the street, literally laying in the street, a letter addressed to Joseph Borelli, Captain Joe Borelli, who was the head of the Omega Task Force that was the group that led the manhunt to track and hunt the son of Sam. And in this letter, he said, I am the son of Sam. So here's where he created that legend and the mythology. He said, Papa Sam needs blood. He's getting old. I must supply him with that blood. I will strike again. You will hear from me again. And he mocked the police in that letter, and he assured them that he would be back once again. So he accomplished several things in that letter. He gave himself his brand name, the Son of Sam, that will stand the test of time. 100 years from now, people will still know who Son of Sam is. And he also accomplished his, at least one of his goals of scaring the hell out of New York City. Because you can imagine, as soon as the news media picked up on this letter, and the fact that he had named himself, that was 24/7 coverage, and it became not just a local news story in New York City, but a national and international news story at that point. And there's something about that name, the Son of Sam, is just so bizarre and compelling that it was destined to become the things of legend. So the answer to your question is he gave himself his own brand name, and he knew, again, I believe, what he was doing, and really looking for recognition and a sense of power over the greatest city in the world.
So when the city took that name and ran with it, and the press was, as we know, the press, they love a headline, and that's a pretty provocative headline. And did David Berkowitz, did he get the same kind of dopamine rush when he would see that after his crimes as when he performed his crimes?
Well, he definitely enjoyed it. He told me he absolutely relished seeing his name, the Son of Sam, in the headlines, the fact that he was in control. He loved it. Yeah, he absolutely did love it. And for our listeners, just so that they understand, what ultimately the Summer of Sam became like. It was a hot, brutally hot, muggy summer in New York City, and people were outside because indoors, not everyone had air conditioning, and they had to be outdoors. And yet people were terrified to be outdoors because no one knew who would become the next victim. And once it became known and reported that he seemed to be targeting young women with long dark hair, well, women cut their hair in New York City. They dyed their hair. You couldn't find a wig in New York City. Wig shops were completely sold out. People were in a complete state of panic. So David Berkowitz truly had the city of New York for nearly a year in an absolute grip of terror. And to answer your question, yes, he was very aware of it, and he did love it.
Next time on Partners in True Crime.
Do I believe that he was part of any sort of a killing group, a killing cult? The answer is absolutely not. And he, again, when we were together, I asked him this question, and he said, in no uncertain terms, I did it myself.
Doc Bonn is taking his serial killer expertise on the road this spring in a live theater event. To purchase a ticket to The Psychology of Serial Killers and Why They Captivate Us, go to psychologyofserialkillers.com. That's psychologyofserialkillers.com to find out when Doc Bonn's going to be in your city.
All rights reserved.
This has been a production of 722 Media Content.